Hi there, hello, I'm Clifford Bates, and welcome once again to reading Machiavelli's Discourses. Today we are we're still looking at book 2 of Discourses, and today we're looking at chapter 24. And it's going to be a little long chapter in the sense that but it's dealing with the thing that he kind of dealt with in the Prince as well. Fortresses are generally much more harmful than useful. So his argument about fortresses. Now, he starts it. You remember the discussion of fortresses in The Prince. Now he does his discussion here. To the wise of our time, it will perhaps seem a thing not well considered that when the Romans wished to secure themselves against the people of Latinum and to this city of Pervenum, Livy 8, right, in 20, they did not think of building some fortresses, which would be a check to keep them faithful. Again, in faith, keep them faithful. Especially since it is the saying in Florence, cited by our wise ones, that in Pisa and other similar cities should be held with fortresses. Now, of course, this is Prince 20, right? That he repeats this saying that, the Florentines, those cities can be held with fortresses. And truly, if the Romans had been made like them, they would have thought of building some. But because they were of another virtue, of another judgment, and of another power, they did not build any. In other words, the Romans had another virtue. They had another virtue, another judgment, another power. They did not build fortresses. In other words, the Florentines built fortresses. Now the argument is because of those three reasons as well. They had a different virtue, they had a different judgment, and they had a different saying. This is why the judgment is this, that in Pisa you hold Pisa with fortresses, right? And while Rome lived freely and followed its orders and virtuous institutions, it never built any to hold either cities or provinces. But it did save. Igizzi suggests possible indignation. It never saved. But note the word generally is in the chapter, so therefore, this is what it says. But it did save some of those that had been built. In other words, it saved some that had been built. In general, they didn't do that. Hence, having seen the Romans' mode of proceeding in this business, and that of the princes of our time, it seems to me that it must be put into consideration whether it is good to build fortresses, or whether they do harm or are useful, or in other words, should we build fortresses, or whether they do harm and are useful to him who builds them. Thus it should be considered that fortresses are either made to defend oneself from the enemies, or to defend oneself from subjects. So they're defended from the enemies or from subjects. In the first case, they are not necessary. In the second, they are very harmful. So therefore, they're not useful to defending that, and they're very harmful to subjects. Beginning to give reasons why they're harmful. In the second case, I say that for the prince or the republic that fears his or its subjects in their rebellion, such fear must first arise from the hatred one's subjects have for one, the hatred from one's bad behavior, and the bad behavior of believing that one can hold them by force, or from lack of prudence of whatever governs them. Okay, this is the bad judgment, bad rulings. One of these things that makes one believe that he can force them is having fortresses next to them. For the bad treatment that is the cause of their hatred arises in good part from the princes or the republics having fortresses, which then, it is true, far more harmful than useful. First, as was said, they make you more audacious and more violent towards your subjects. So therefore, then there is not security inside them that you persuade yourself of, since all the forces and all the violence that you use to hold a people are null except of two. Either you are always able to put a good army in the field, as the Romans were, or you disperse, eliminate disorder, and disunite them in such a mode that they cannot get together to hurt you. So in other words, having a fortress, you either put an army in the field in a moment, like the Romans did, or you disperse them, you eliminate them, or disorder them and disunite them in such a mode that they cannot arm against you. Because if you impoverish them, arms remain to be despoiled. Right? This is quoted from Latin juvenile satires. Right? If you impoverish them, arms remain to be despoiled. If you disarm them, furies supply the arms. Again, this is quoted from Virgil Aeneid. Right? If you kill their heads and follow by injuring the others, the heads are reborn like that of a hydra. So in other words, if you impoverish them, the arms, they'll have arms. They remain the arms. And if you disarm them, the furies will supply their arms. If you kill their heads and follow by other injuries of others, their heads are reborn like a hydra. If you make fortresses, they are useful at times of peace because they give you more spirit to do evil to them. But they are useless in times of war because they are assaulted by enemies and by the subjects. Nor is it possible for them to put up resistance to both the one and the other. In other words, both the subjects and in other words, it's the subjects are, hey, come in, kill them, yeah, we'll join you. And if ever they were less than useless, it is in our times in respect to artillery, right? The artillery comes in, they're useless, right? Because of whose fury it is impossible to defend small places where one cannot withdraw to embankments, as we discussed above, right? This is again in chapter 8. In other words, Discourses 2, chapter 17, right? First. Now, he says, I wish to dispute this matter in more detail. Either you, prince, wish to hold the people of your city in check with these fortresses, or you, prince or republic, wish to check a city seized by war. I wish to turn to the prince and I say to him that to hold his citizens in check with such a fortress cannot be more useless, for causes I said above. For it makes you more prompt and less hesitant to crush them, and this crushing them makes them so despoiled makes them so disposed towards your ruin, and you inflame them so that the fortresses, which is the cause of that, cannot defend you. In other words, they wanted, they're just so disposed to your ruin and inflame. The fortresses are a symbol of your power, and it would be a reason to go against you. So much so that a wise and good prince, so as to keep himself good and not to give cause to or dare his sons to become bad, will never make a fortress, so that they may found themselves not upon fortresses, but upon the benevolence of men. Right? This is the idea that You don't do that. And if Count Francesco Sforza, who became Duke of Milan, was reputed wise and nevertheless made a fortress of Milan, I say that in this he was not wise, and the effect had demonstrated that such a fortress was for his heirs harm, not their security. In other words, the example that that Forza was said to be a wise man, but no, is by making the fortress there, did nothing but harm his heirs in the future. In other words, not their security. For judging that by means of it they could live securely while offending their citizens and subjects, they did not spare in any kind of violence. So having become hatred behind measure, they lost the state when the enemy first assaulted them. So again, 9 here, again, a pardon, right? They mode, and the French took Milan from Forza in 1500 and again 1515, right? So they took it easily. In other words, the French took it easily from them. They had lost it twice in that sense, right? Because of that. Because why they thought they did not, what is it? 9 is pardon. They did not pardon any violence, a kind of violence, so that having become beyond any measure, right? Beyond any mode, they were hated so much that they lost the state whenever the enemies first assaulted them. In war, that fortress neither defended them nor was at all useful to them, and in peace it was very much harm to them. For if they had not had it, and if by their little prudence they had harshly managed their citizens, they would have uncovered the danger sooner and have withdrawn from it. And then they would have been able to resist the French thrust more spiritedly with friendly subjects and without a fortress than an enemy one with the fortress, right? In other words, if they had the people, having a people friendly to you or on your side is more useful than a fortress, right? They do not help you in any respect, for they are lost either through the fraud of whoever guards them, or, in other words, the fraud of who guards them, or through the violence of whoever assaults them, or through starvation. So therefore the cannon, right, the violence and the cannon destroys them, or by starvation, right? So that the fraud offends them, so they're persuaded to open them up and surrender them, right? Therefore, that's the. And if you wish that they should help you and aid you to recover a lost state, where the fortress alone is left to you, you must have an army with you, which you can assault him who has expelled you. And if you had that army, you would get the state back in any case, even if the fortress was not there. And so much more easily if the men would be more friendly to you than they were to you. They were to you when you badly treated them because of the pride of the fortress. In other words, it would have been easier to get them back. Either way you could get them back. You have an army, right? The fortress, and it would have been easy, and it would have been easier to get them back if the people were not afraid of you and because of how bad you treated them, or ill-disposed towards you, because of the fortress, how you treated them when you had the fortress. In other words, if they were on your side, it'd be much easier to take it back. Your army could take it back than without the people on your side, right? It is seen from experience that this fortress of Milan has done nothing useful to either them, neither the Sforza nor the French, in times adverse to the one and the other. Instead, it brought them very much harm and ruin to all, since because of it they did not think of a more honest mode of holding that state. In other words, they ruled it by badly. When Giabatto, Duke of Urbano, and his son Federico, who in his time was Such an esteemed captain was expelled from his state by Cesare Borgia, the son of Pope Alexander VI, and then returned there through an accident that arose. He had all the fortresses that were in that province ruined, since he judged them more harmful. Since he was loved by men, out of respect for them, he did not want fortresses. He saw he could not defend fortresses on the enemy's account, since an army in the field was necessary to defend them. So he returned to ruining them. Having expelled the Bentivogli from Bologna, Pope Julius made a fortress in that city, and then had the people vexed. In other words, assassinated, literally assassinated, 12? Assassinated by his governor, Francesco Eli, Papal of Bologna, right? In other words, he had the people assassinated by his governor, right? Vexed. The people therefore rebelled. He lost the fortress at once, and thus the fortress did not help him and did hurt him. Whereas if he had behaved otherwise, it would have helped him. In other words, the fortress didn't save him. His actions did. His behavior would have saved him. And when Niccolò di Castro, father of the Vintilli, Padlo and Vincenzo Vintilli, Prince 8 and 12, right, 8, had returned to his fatherland, from which he had been exiled, he at once demolished the 2 fortresses Pope Sixtus had built there, judging them not the fortress, but judging that not the fortress, but the benevolence of the people had kept him in his state. But all the other examples, that of Genoa, which have ensued in recent times, is the freshest and most notable in every aspect, and capable of showing the uselessness of buildings, fortresses, in the utility in demolishing them. Everyone knows that in 1507 Genoa rebelled against Louis XII, King of France, who came in person with all his forces to reacquire it. And when he recovered it, he made a fortress stronger than all the others, of which there is knowledge at the present, right? For it was impregnable, but its site, and by every other circumstance, being placed upon top of the hill that extends into the sea, called Confidella by the Genovese. From it he could fire on the whole port and a great part of the city of Genoa. It occurred then in 1512 that when the French troops were expelled from Italy, Genoa rebelled, notwithstanding the fortress. Octavio Forgiolo took over its state, and with all industry, within a limit of 16 months, he captured it by starvation. Everyone believed, and many consoled, that he should have preserved it as his refuge for any accident. But being very prudent, he knew that not fortresses, but the will of men maintain princes in their states, and he ruined it. In other words, it's not that. In other words, the example is the French thought it was great, powerful, but then what happened was the rebellion happened. The French was kicked out of the city, and then the fortress will hold it. But no, he starved them out. And what happened? Okay, then you should keep for yourself. No. He ruined it. Why? Because it's not fortresses that preserve you. It is the goodwill of your subjects. In other words, it's as he says here. What is it? In other words, it's but the will of men maintain princes in their states. This founding his state not upon the fortresses, but upon his virtue and prudence, he has held and holds it. And whereas 1,000 infantrymen were customary enough to vary the state of, in other words, In other words, 1,000 infantrymen were customary enough to vary the state of Genoa. His adversaries have assaulted him with 10,000 and have not been able to hurt him. So before, little infantry would take him, but now they assault him with tens of thousands and they have not been able to hurt him. By this, it is thus seen that demolishing the fortress has not hurt Octavio, and by making it did not defend the king. For if he had been able to come into Italy with his army, he could have recovered Genoa though he did not have a fortress there. But if he were able to come into Italy with his army, he could not have held Genoa, though he did have a fortress there. Thus, for the king, it was expensive to make and shameful to lose. For Octavio is glorious to acquire and useful to ruin. So again, it makes the example that the king, it was expensive, and when he lost it, it was shameful. And by winning it, he accomplished it. By ruining it, it was useful for him. Now let us come to the republics that make fortresses, not in their fatherlands, but in towns they acquire. And if it is said, examples of France and Genoa should not be enough to show this fallacy, I wish Florence and Pisa to be enough for me. The Florentines made fortresses there to hold that city. They did not know that if they wished to hold the city, they had always been an enemy to the Florentine name, had lived freely, and had in rebellion had freedom for its refuge. It was necessary to observe the Roman mode, either to make them a partner or to demolish it. In other words, demolish a city. In other words, you don't put a fortress there. That's stupid. Either you make them a partner. If they want to be free, then make them a partner. Make them part of you, a partner. Don't make them subject or destroy them. For the fortress's virtue was seen during the coming King of Charles, King of France. Right, this is 15 Charles of A de France, who invaded Italy in 1494, to whom they were given up either through the lack of faith of those who guarded them, or through the fear of a greater evil, the French cannon. Right, whereas if they had not had any, the Florentine would not have. Whereas if they had not any, the Florentines would not have founded on them their ability, their belief, the ability. 16, the power, right? The power, their power to hold Pisa, and the king would not have been able to deprive the Florentines of that city in any way, right? If they had been, in other words, if Pisa would have been their ally, their willing ally, not a willing friend, not their enemy. In that sense, they would not have been able to use, not derive the Florentines of that city in any way. The mode by which it had been kept until that time would perhaps have been sufficient to preserve it, and without doubt would not have given a worse proof than the fortress, right? I conclude thus that for holding one's own fatherland, a fortress is harmful, and for holding towns that have been acquired, fortresses are useless. So therefore, they're harmful if you're your own country, and they're useless in acquiring things. I wish to be enough for me the authority of the Romans, who knocked down walls and did not put up walls in lands they wished to hold by violence. To whomever cites me against this, the opinion of Tatro, 17, Livy 25, 26, and 27, right? the ancient in ancient and Brescia in the modern times, which places were recovered from rebellion by subjects by means of fortresses. Right? These two cases, Tartu and I respond that for the recovery of Taranto, at the end, of the year of Fabius Maximus was an end of the year, or the head of the year. Fabius Maximus was sent with all his armies, which would have been capable of recovering it even if the fortress had not been there. And even if Fabius did not use that way, if he had not been there, he would not have used another that would have led to the same effect. In other words, he brought his army, and it was the same effect. It was, in other words, the fortress was no help in that sense. No direct. He brought all his army. In other words, and if not been there, and if Fabius did not use that way, if it had not been there, he would have used another way. In other words, for the same effect. In other words, it was so what? It was something that was useful to him. And if it wasn't there, he would have picked another means. Okay. I do not know of what utility a fortress may be to restore a town to you that, for its recovery, has need of a consular army and a Fabius Maximum for captain. In other words, I don't know how you're going to do that by a fortress. In other words, I don't know how a fortress, what utility a fortress may have to you when you had a consular army and a man like Fabius Maximus. And that the Romans would have retaken it in any case is seen by the example of Caputa, where there was no fortress and they required it by the virtue of the army. But let us come to Brescia. I say that occurred in the rebellion. In other words, I say that what occurred in that rebellion rarely occurs. That the fortress that is left with your forces when the town has rebelled has an army that is big and nearby, like that of the French. For Monsignor de Fleu, the king captain, with his army at Boulogne. And when he heard the loss of Brescia, he went without at point deferring it. Arrived in 3 days at Brescia and got back the town to the fortress. To be able to help, therefore, even the fortress of Brescia had need of Monsieur de Foyt and the French army that brought it to relief in 3 days. Thus, this example is not enough against the contrary examples. For in the wars of our times, many fortresses have been taken and retaken with the same fortune with which the countryside was retaken and taken, not only in Lombardy, but in the Romagna, in the Kingdom of Naples, and throughout all parts of Italy. So therefore he's saying that, the places that had fortresses and didn't, for the provinces that, they were taken and retaken the same way. The fortresses don't give any advantage to preserve or to get retaken easier. And the last paragraph, section 4. But as to the buildings of fortresses to defend oneself from enemies from outside, I say they are not necessary to people in kingdoms that have good armies, and are useless to those who do not have good armies. So therefore, it's not useful to those who have good armies, and it's useless for those who do not have good armies. For good armies without fortresses are sufficient to defend oneself, and fortresses without good armies cannot defend you. This is seen from the experience of those who have been held to be most excellent both in government and in other things, as is seen with the Romans and the Spartans. For if the Romans did not build fortresses, the Spartans not only abstained from them, but did not permit their cities to have walls. for they wish the virtue of the individual man to defend them, and no other defense. In other words, they want their cities that the men themselves do it. They shouldn't have any other recourse. They tear down the Spartans tear down the walls. Don't want walls. They want the virtue of the individual man to defend them, and no other defense. Whereas the Spartans was asked by an Athenian if the walls of the Athens. Wherefore, when a Spartan was asked by an Athenian if the walls of Athens seemed to him beautiful, he responded, yes, if they were inhabited by women, right? In other words, this is Plutarch's sayings of the Spartans, said by Aegeus at Corinth, and said by Theopius and Algaeus about unspecified cities, right? In other words, so therefore, okay, it's in other words, yeah, is the city, yeah, if it's dependent on women. Thus, if a prince who has good armies has some fortress upon the seacoast at the frontiers of his states that can stand up against the enemy for several days until he is in order, it would sometimes be a useful thing, but it is not necessary. In other words, maybe if you have a situation where you have a seacoast, you have army, you have a good armies. You have a good army, but has some fortress upon the seacoast at the frontier of the state to stand up to the enemy for several days. It might be, it would be sometimes to be a useful thing, but it's not necessity. But if a prince does not have a good army, to have fortresses through his states or at the frontier is harmful, useless. Harmful since he easily loses them, and when lost, they cannot make war on him. Or if they are, however, so strong, however so strong the enemy cannot seize, so strong that the enemy can't seize them, they are left behind by the enemy army and come to be fruitless. In other words, you bypass them. They're easy to take, but if they're not easy to take, I'll bypass them. Because why? The army, they can't go. In other words, they're stuck there. They can't go. In other words, they can't chase the army or can't fight the army that moves. For when they do not have hardy opposition, good armies enter into enemy countries without hesitation, over cities or fortresses that they may leave behind. So, as seen in ancient histories, as is seen in to have been done, have been done by Francisco Maria. 20, right? It says Francisco Maria de Rova, right? Francisco Maria, who assaulted Obrino in very recent times, left behind 10 enemy cities without any hesitation. Thus, a prince who can make a good army can do without building fortresses. One who does not have a good army should not build them. He should fortify well the city he inhabits and keep it provided with its citizens well disposed, so to be able to sustain an enemy thrust until either an accord or external aid may free him. In other words, he doesn't have good, he should, in other words, he should fortify the city. In other words, he shouldn't make fortresses, but he should fortify the city, right? Why? That they can hold off the thing, and they maybe all other plans are expensive in times of peace and used in times of war. So he who will consider all I have said will come to know that, in other words, all who considers all I have said will come to know that as the Romans were wise in every other order of theirs, so they were prudent in this judgment of the Latins and the Primitives, in which, not thinking of fortresses, they secured themselves against them with more virtuous and wiser modes. They didn't bring fortresses. They either caressed them or exterminated them, right? In other words, this is the two strategies the Romans picked. In other words, then the fortress is thus a kind of seen as a middle way, and not to be chosen. The middle ways are observed. So we'll stop here. Please put your comments or questions in the comment section, and I will respond to them when I see them. If you like it, hit the like button. Please hit the like button. It helps. If you liked it, share it. Share it on social media. Share it on your friends. Email it. Share it far and wide. Another thing you can do is, if you've not subscribed, please subscribe. If not, encourage others to come check the channel out and subscribe and help grow the channel some. All these things, commenting, liking, sharing, subscribing, all helps improve the algorithm. And by improving the algorithm, what happens is it becomes, in other words, when people searching for Machiavelli's Discourses or things like this, they'll come to find it. Another thing you can do is, you didn't like it, of course, you can always say no, thumbs down it, but say why in the comments so people can benefit from it. Because again, we're doing this for learning and not for, so people can, it's purpose of, tell what was wrong, and maybe someone can benefit from it. Now, another thing you can do is, if you want to follow me on social media, the social media links are below. If you want to know more about me as a scholar and as a researcher and check out my scholarship and stuff like that, check out the academic social media links below the social media links. And if you want to help me, you can do so. Help me in the sense financially. In that sense, you can do so. Help make this channel to cover what I do. Please do so. Subscribe, star, or Patreon. The links are below. And another thing you can do is you can, buy one of my books. They're listed below. Some of my books are listed below. You can order them. If you find them at the bookstore, great, but you can order them online or through an internet distributor like Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Libris, Book Depository, or buy directly to the publisher. Now, and of course, the ebook themselves, you can find the ebooks, the one ebook, dedicated ebook, you can find it on Kindle or Apple and other available things, or by the publisher. And others, and I think at least one of the other books are, the University of Warsaw Press can be ordered on as a PDF, an ebook PDF available through Warsaw University Press directly, and I know that the LSU book is still available on Kindle, Barnes & Noble, and online as ebooks. So that's it. We'll stop here. We now look at the next chapter. Will be 25. So therefore stop here today and have a great day. So take care. Bye-bye.